tribulation period? Tribulation, okay? Specifically, what kind of tribulation? Well, we're going to use the words wrath of God time and again. So God is going to pour his wrath out upon the world, okay? Upon all of creation, actually, and we're going to see that time and time again during this tribulation period. Is God going to pour his wrath out on you? Not if you're saved. Once you're saved, you are immune from God's wrath. Immune might not be exactly the right word to use there, but you're part of God's family. God's wrath does not fall upon you. As a matter of fact, God's wrath towards you, because of your sin, has been now placed upon Christ. So Christ already took God's wrath for you. There's no wrath of God left for you. Well, so as we go into this period of God's wrath being poured upon the earth, it only makes sense that God's people will be taken out of the earth and protected. Now, there's a bunch of different views about, let me read another verse. This is a continuation of that 1 Thessalonians verse, passage that we just read. So this is a little bit, a few verses later. Like in the next chapter 5, 1 to 4. But of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day should overtake you as a thief. And he continues on with some discussion and to give them comfort and things like that about this. And he ends this with, in verse 9 of 1 Thessalonians 5, for God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ. The word salvation there is not referring specifically to salvation in the sense that we normally use it, eternal salvation. It's related to that, but it's the idea of we're being saved from God's wrath that's going to be poured out on the earth. 1 Corinthians also has a passage, chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, verses 50 to 53. Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. And then in Matthew 24, this is verses 40 to 41, this is a continuation of that Olivet Discourse when we talked about it a second ago. It says, then two shall be in the field, one shall be taken, and the other left. Two women shall be grinding on the mill, one shall be taken, and the other left. Okay, and there's a lot of theology in there. We won't dig into it all, but the idea of the rapture is going to occur. It's going to leave some behind. It's going to leave some, and some will be reunited with God. And that's when the fireworks really start, okay? So let's talk about the timing of the rapture. When's it going to take place? Well, there's actually a bunch of different views. Probably even among folks that would generally agree with my timeline, most of them put the rapture at the beginning of the 7-year period. But not everybody. We won't dive into what all of the different reasons for the different things, but I want you at least to have heard them and be a little bit acquainted with them. Probably next to them, and one that I'm sort of partial to, I don't know, I sort of go back and forth between this. This is called the pre-tribulation rapture. Why is it called pre-tribulation? Because we're such geniuses at naming these things, right? It's pre, before the tribulation. Well, we have another one that we call mid-tribulation. When do you think the mid-tribulation occurs? We're geniuses when we name these things, aren't we?
So when the pre-trib was actually, that concept was actually done, that was just 100 years ago.
Well, so actually all dispensationalism really came into vogue in the early 20th century. We won't go through the whole history here, but I've taught this part of the KBBI class. and it got, with a guy by the name of Darby, got rolled into the Scofield Reference Bible. That's one of the things that really made it popular. Actually, all of dispensationalism isn't new, but in some ways is new. That's the first time it was really codified as that. I won't get into it. We sort of skipped over words like historic premillennialism versus regular, historic millennialism versus premillennial, dispensational premillennialism and things like that. That's going to get way too deep. So people have held different ideas, and a lot of it is sort of depending on how you dissect some of the timing in Revelation, and that can be a little bit tricky. After all, Revelation, as if you've ever read it, even aside from the imagery, it's telling a bunch of a bunch of themes, if you will, and how you time those themes matters on exactly where you place some of this stuff. Some things are clear where they should be placed. Other things you'd say, well, it could be here, it could be here. And part of that is because it doesn't go strictly chronological. After all, you sit down with your spouse at dinner and you ask her or him how their day went. Do you get a strict chronological story? No. They'll tell one thing that happened and another thing that happened and then another thing that happened and then another thing that happened. And sometimes they are sequential, and maybe overall they're, chronological, but sometimes life didn't happen quite like that, right? You said one thing and had to finish that story, but the beginning of the next story was in the middle of that one. And so how you dissect that with Revelation depends on exactly where you put some of these things. Like I said, I tend to be a mid-trib person rather than a pre-trib person, but that's not something I'm going to argue with someone over. And I don't know, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays sometimes. I don't know. I can understand the arguments on both sides, but one other thing that I should mention is that there's a bunch of signs going on. We won't go read all the verses, but there's things to indicate that the tribulation is coming. And as a matter of fact, the verse that we read described them as like birthing pains. In one, it says, like a woman travaileth. It's talking about giving birth and things like that. Do we know when the rapture is going to occur? No. But we have some signs, and the Olivet Discourse and some other passages talk about those signs. They don't have dates on them or anything like that, despite what that televangelist on the TV show tells you, that tells you about what date it's going to be. I've read all those books. I've taught classes on that. One of my favorite classes to teach is a class we call End of Time, and we look at all those failed end times prophecies, all the way back to guys at the time of Christ that were predicting end times prophecies, and then it didn't come about, and things like that. So we got signs here, and we'll just put that right down here, because some of those signs that the tribulation is coming, the rapture is coming, well, if we put the rapture here as a mid-tribulation rapture, then some of the signs will actually be within the 7-year period, but not at the 3.5-year period yet when the rapture actually occurs. There are some other views about when the rapture will occur, such as there's something called the post-tribulation view. And this is rather common in some circles, and that is that the rapture takes place, that the saints will make it through the tribulation period, and they were raptured right before the second coming. And so when it says that God's wrath will not be upon the saints, the verse we just read, what it's saying is not that God will remove them through a rapture, that God will protect them during this time. Okay? And that's a post-tribulation. And then there's all sorts of other variants. There's one that's called the pre-wrath, which is, it's not here at the end, but somewhere around here when God's ready to pour his final wrath out. So the saints will go most of the way through the tribulation, but not quite make it all the way to the end, and they'll be raptured out. There's one called the split tribulation, which is that some and the split tribulation and partial rapture, and they're sort of variants of each other. The partial rapture is that only some people of the saved will be raptured out, and some saved will exist will go through the tribulation period. Split rapture is that there's actually going to be two raptures, one of some group of people, some of another group of people. Everyone that proposes these has their own rationale for why that's what they believe. And we're not going to track any of that down because we'll be here until next week's class if we try that. Okay? Okay, so that's the rapture. And I'll leave it either here as a pre-trib or here as a mid-trib, and you get to choose between them. And if you want to choose one of these others, well, then you got to build your own timeline. Okay? Now we really start getting into some stuff. And this is where we start to kick in with Revelation. Most of Revelation is really built around explaining this tribulation period. Some of it, the end of it, is about explaining these last two, the millennium and eternity, and then the first 3 chapters are sort of on a different topic. So we've already run into something that happens after the rapture. What's happening in heaven after the rapture? Well, if you go and read Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 5, first of all, there's a whole bunch of worshiping going on and things like that. We're not going to cover all of that. But one thing that we did already mention is that believers will get glorified bodies, resurrected bodies. Okay? Now, even that, so we're going to stick that someplace. We're going to stick that, typically we stick that some here right after the rapture someplace. We'll put it right there for now. Okay? That's actually a little bit confusing if you think about it, but that's okay. We call this the first resurrection. If you think about it, though, there has to be several first resurrections because we have all these people from the church age. They're going to be raptured. They're going to be resurrected. But we're also going to have plenty of saints in this period. They're going to have to be resurrected at some point as well. Oh, and as a matter of fact, when we get to the millennium, we're going to see there's going to be a bunch of people in the millennium that are saved and have to be raptured or have to be resurrected at some point too. So this first resurrection, when we call it the first resurrection, actually is going to happen in phases, and that's really no matter where you put the rapture. It's going to happen. This first resurrection is going to have to happen in phases because people eligible for that first rapture are going to show up in different phases, and whether it's 3 phases, 4 phases. Some people say the Old Testament folks will happen at a different time than the church age folks, and we can explore that in the details. We're not going to tackle that now. So all that makes sense? But at some point, Christians are going to have to be resurrected. We've also talked about a couple other things that are going to happen. Well, we talked about last week, or maybe it's 2 weeks ago, about the marriage of the Lamb. Well, most people put the marriage of the Lamb here right after the rapture. So we'll do that. I still got a stack of cards here, don't worry. Now I got a bunch of blank cards. We can fill in and put other things. So we got this marriage of the Lamb going on. Now, most folks sort of believe that's right about the same time, after the resurrection, with one more event in the middle we're going to have to talk about. Some folks put the actual marriage of the Lamb, and in Revelation it appears like in the 19th chapter. So that's right, all the way at the end of the tribulation. So that's a case where we're not sure, and it doesn't really matter. One more thing that we ought to have. Between the resurrection and the marriage of the Lamb, we're going to have something called the judgment seat of Christ. So we'll stick that right here. And actually, most people say the judgment seat of Christ happens before the marriage of the Lamb. So we'll put that right there as well. What's the judgment seat of Christ? Well, that's when we, as saved people, appear before Christ to be judged for our works. Well, wait a minute. I thought we were all about grace, not about works. Well, Scripture seems to indicate that we will be judged for our works, but not to determine our salvation. We can't earn our salvation. It's not like we can come and say, here's a whole bunch of works. Now, let me into heaven, God. No, it's the opposite. God says, I allow you into heaven, but the crowns you get there will depend upon what you've done on earth. And then it turns out, I didn't pull out the passage, but the passages that talk about this then indicate, well, we just take those crowns and give them to Christ anyway, because, it's not our ability. Christ did it. Holy Spirit did it, working through us because of what Christ did for us. So we didn't really earn anything anyway. It's not like we can claim credit for those works. But nonetheless, it does sort of indicate that there is some judgment of believers for how they live their lives, not to determine salvation, though. Got to foot stomp that time and again, because if you take it out of context, we really get to the wrong place. Does that make sense? Okay? Okay, so those are some things happening in heaven, and again, a couple of those may be here at the end of the tribulation period, but it doesn't really matter. What's going on earth? Here's where things really get interesting. What's going on earth all this time? And here's where Revelation really becomes relevant. No pun intended. Revelation becomes relevant. Okay? So, before we even get to the rise of the Antichrist, some folks put the invasion of Israel. This is from Ezekiel chapters 35 or so to 39. Some folks put that at the end of the tribulation period leading into the millennium. Some folks put it here right at the beginning of the tribulation period. And I don't know, I could be convinced either way. So we'll just stick it there. But here's the basic idea for those that put it at the beginning. After the rapture happens, well, first of all, what's happening once the rapture happens? Well, there's chaos, right? A whole bunch of people just went missing. And when that happens, a coalition, sometimes called Gog and Magog, although that phrase is used a couple of places in the scriptures, a coalition of northern forces take advantage of this to mount an assault against Israel. They're going to wipe Israel out of existence. And they just about do it. They attack it, and all of Israel's supposed allies flee, including, not by name, but the U.S. must flee because, and one can sort of read the newspaper and see how, you remember what a newspaper is. It's that thing that they print that tells you the news, and now you just look it up online. Okay, now you can look in the newspapers and see how that sort of jumps out. So Israel is invaded, and just about they march on Israel. Israel is just about ready to fall, and according to, let me pull out some verses here. This is in Ezekiel 38 and 39 chapters. God miraculously saves Israel. Basically, there's a giant earthquake. There's infighting in this army. Disease hits it. There's torrential rain, a hailstorm, fire, burning sulfur, and the attacking armies are all wiped out. Now, notice, and you can sort of see why that might, if you know something about what's happening here at the end of the millennium, or end of the tribulation, you can see where that might fit there too. But for now, let's put it in there. And you can see now the world is really in chaos, right? First you had all these people vanish, and now you have the strongest armies in the world wiped out. So things are really chaotic. And what happens? Peace. How does peace happen? Yeah, a man steps up and says, I can solve all this. We call him the Antichrist. Although at this time, at the time he's stepping up, that's not so obvious. We won't go into all the details about the Antichrist, except he promises and actually establishes peace. Matter of fact, the primary people that he establishes peace with is Israel. He establishes a covenant with Israel. And even one of my favorite things, something that's actually very important. He allows them to rebuild the temple and start the sacrifices. So from a Jewish standpoint, things are really hunky-dory. For the first time, now, of course, you can, we understand recent events and after the establishment of Israel after World War II, and all that kind of stuff. All that plays into the details here. But for the first time that anyone can remember, Israel feels safe because this man has brokered an agreement that protects them. That's what's going on earth during this time. Okay, and again, depending where the rapture is, some folks put some of this stuff on here, but for the most part, it's here. And and we talked about some of this stuff could be moved around, but you get in any case, it's the same basic idea. What's going on earth? What else is going on? Oh, by the way, there is a couple of points we ought to bring about the Antichrist. He arises out of the revived Roman Empire. We talked about the revived Roman Empire last week when we talked about the toes of the image that Daniel saw and things like that. He achieves absolute power, and he seems to bring peace and prosperity out of all this chaos. And he's hated by a guy they call the false prophet, and it starts marshaling about a one-world religion. They rebuild the temple, resumption of the sacrificial systems. We got one more view about what's happening during this first period. From God's wrath standpoint, things start to happen. In Revelation chapter 5 is really where you sort of pick up the story. Revelation chapter 5, it talks about opening of a scroll. They say, who's able to open the scroll? And someone steps up. Jesus steps up and is the one who's able to open the scroll. And unrolling the scroll, opening this scroll starts a series of things, a series of judgments. The first is one we call the seven scrolls, or the seven seals, actually. I wrote scrolls here, but it's the idea that it's one giant scroll sealed in different places. And I've made that a different color because we're, first of all, getting pretty crowded there, but also because now that starts a series of judgments. Seal number 1, the rider of the white horse goes out to conquer and make war. Most people interpret that to be the Antichrist, and he goes forward and makes war. That's Revelation 6, 1-2. Peace is taken from the earth, people slaying each other at the massive level. That may be a reference to that army, that big fight there, or maybe something else. Widespread famine starts to happen, and eventually massive casualties. Again, that may be that war against Israel by the forces of the north, or maybe something else. But massive casualties is Revelation 6, 7, and 8. 9 through 11, massive numbers of God's people are mercilessly martyred. We're going to start repeating that theme over and over again here. Seal 6 is open, devastating earthquakes and cosmic disturbances. And then we get to Seal 7. Seal 7 is actually no judgment, except it opens the next set of judgments. And then in Revelation chapter 7, there's a whole chapter that's sort of an interlude that talks about the martyrdom of God's people. And then it gets into the trumpet. And things get worse. Notice where are we putting all this stuff? This is on the easy side of that middle point. So we get the 7 trumpets. You think things were bad for the scroll? This is now in Revelation chapter 8. Hell and fire rain down. 1/3 of the earth is burned up. A fiery mountain, trumpet 2, a fiery mountain plunges into the sea. Result might be we don't know the exact reference, whether this is volcanic activity or what, we don't know. But a fiery mountain plunges in the sea, resulting in the death of 1/3 of the sea creatures. 1/3 of the earth is burned up. 1/3 of the sea creatures have burned up. The star from heaven, possibly a meteor or something, strikes, causing a near extinction level impact. That's trumpet 3. Trumpet 4 is some cosmic disturbances. We won't go into all the details. Trumpet 5 Hideous demons are released and engage in tormenting humans. Whoa. Trumpet 6, 1/3 of mankind is killed by plagues. 1/3 of mankind is killed. And that gives us to Trumpet 7. And again, Trumpet 7 doesn't have a specific thing. Instead, Trumpet 7 introduces the next set of judgments. We have a little interlude before we get into the next set of judgments. Because we've now reached that mid-tribulation period. And there something very significant happens. Well, first thing that happened, many significant things. The first significant thing that happens is in Revelation 12, chapter 12, it talks about Satan is kicked out of heaven. Remember when we talked about Satan many, many months ago? Satan has access to heaven today. What's he do when he's up in heaven? He spends most of his time accusing us and trying to create other mischief, but that's the big thing. We reach at this point, we see a definite shift in the way that God is bringing wrath upon the world, upon the creation. And part of this is that he flat out bars Satan from heaven. Satan has been cast out. Well, if Satan's not going to live in heaven, where's he going to live? Here on earth. You think things were hairy before. Now we have Satan himself living here on earth, and all of his demons and all that kind of stuff. Something happens. The Antichrist is wounded. We don't get a lot of other details other than that, but it just says that the Antichrist is wounded and then is resurrected. I use resurrected in quotes. He's wounded and then resurrected. Now, the Antichrist is just a man. What does that sound like? Sounds like Christ. Coincidence? What do we have? We have Satan copying what happened with Christ in this wounding of the Antichrist and then his supposed resurrection. What happened when Christ was crucified and resurrected? Well, a few people believed. Most of the world says, yeah, sure. What's going to happen here? The opposite. People are going to say, wow, this guy must be the Christ, the Messiah. He's not wearing a big sign that says, I'm the Antichrist. No. Now, before he was just saying, hey, I'm the best leader you can have. I'm the politician. I'm the one that brought peace and prosperity and things like that. Now he's making the real transition to proclaiming himself to be the Christ, the Messiah.
Does that mean that the Antichrist will be Jewish?
Does that mean the Antichrist will be Jewish? That is very much debated. One of the books I pulled the most recent stuff out of says, no, he's not Jewish. And Gate listed a bunch of reasons why. I've read many other books that said he must be Jewish, and here's the reasons why. Others have said he must be Muslim, based on recent events. And others said, no, not at all. And other folks have said he must be at least a European, because he's coming out of the revived Roman Empire. He's not one of the 10 horns, if you remember the discussion of the 10 horns and the 10 toes from Daniel. He's actually he's at an 11th horn, and he defeats 3 of the other horns, replaces 3 of the 11 horns, and then grows bigger than the remaining 7. Some people have said that must mean that he's a European, because they view the Roman Empire as being, sort of an equivalent of Europe and the European Union, things like that. So the answer is a bunch of people say yes, a bunch of people say no. That's the best I can do you. Okay? And I can go show you the reasons why each side says what, and that's where we are. Okay? So now the big thing, and so there's one last thing that really happens here. Many other things are going to happen, but one last real thing that we need to point out. Now he's declaring himself to be the Messiah. How's that go over? Well, goes over with most people quite well, frankly, from all we can read. As a matter of fact, the Holy Spirit has now been taken from the earth. There's not really any conviction of anything else. But then something happens. He walks in and desecrates the temple. We talked about he rebuilt the temple, or had the temple rebuilt. We probably got time to review the temple. You know, we're already on, depending exactly how you count them, we're already on the second or third version of the temple. We had the original temple built by Solomon. By David brought the stuff, and Solomon actually did the construction. That lasted for a while. And when they fell to the Babylonians, that was destroyed. Or actually, and then there was no temple for a while. And then when Cyrus, we looked at this last week, when Cyrus the Great, the king of Medo-Persia, said, go back and rebuild it, and it was rebuilt. It was rebuilt, and actually it's very small. That's Ezra and Nehemiah talk all about that. And then that's the temple that was standing when Jesus was there, although it got a major upgrade and facelift. So that's sometimes counted as a third one, or sometimes as a continuation of that rebuilt one. But we'd call that Herod's temple. That's what was standing at the time of Jesus. It got wiped out at the time of in 70 AD by Titus. And there's not been a temple there since. Now we have a temple that has been rebuilt, refurnished. They just established sacrifices and things like that. And now the Antichrist goes in and says, just like we saw with Antiochus Epiphanes IV, we talked about last week, the Greek ruler, who was sort of a type, a picture of the Antichrist, walks in and says, okay, we got this nice temple, but I am God. You need to worship me here. And your sacrifices are to me. And your worship is on me because I am God. And he desecrates the temple, goes in, sits down, and says, worship me. Probably very similar to the desecration that happened under Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And so that's a really big deal. And it's a really big deal because now it really becomes decision day for the remaining Jews. Notice how with the church age gone, with churches gone, New Testament believers gone, God's focus really is back on Israel. And it has become reckoning day for Israel. And we don't know how many go what way, but most of them, but at least some of them say, okay, we'll worship you, doesn't matter to us. Others say, this is a stone too far, this is too much. And they realize what is happening, and they refuse to worship him. And so what does he do? He systematically hunts down Jews to kill. We've heard that theme before in history, have we not? But we're starting to get here into the second part. And even to the point of Israel, the remnant of Israel's, but what we call them now, the few remaining believers who are now realizing what is happening and he hunts them down, and there's a vigorous prosecution of them. He even chases them away, and they flee, probably to Petra or someplace like that. We don't know for sure, it's not named, but he chases them to the south. And we have this program of systematic persecution of the Jews, of the remnant, the Jews who now believe that Christ was the Messiah. There's a bunch of other things going on now. One of everybody's favorite, everybody talks about this one, the mark of the beast. Okay, the 666 and the mark of the beast, all that kind of stuff. All that's really, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. We won't go into all the details. But that's talking about how this giant, this world government has been established, and through that world government, the Antichrist is controlling all commerce, all, everything. Everything is under his control. All religion. We often call that Babylon, because here in Revelation, they call it Babylon as an analogy to the Babylonian Empire before. Okay? And we mentioned there's all sorts of martyrs going on. There's whole chapters that talk in Revelation that talk about martyrs. There we go. And there's even, you wonder what's going on in heaven, in chapter 14, there's a bunch of announcements going on in heaven saying about we're in the middle of the tribulation and here's what's going to happen and things like that. So that's Revelation chapter 14. Whoosh! Now, things get real serious. You say, real serious? It wasn't serious before. A third of the earth dying, a third of the, no, no. Yeah, it really gets serious. Because remember, we had that seventh trumpet that introduced the next set of 7 judgments. And we'll talk about 6 of them to begin with. We have the 6 bowl judgments. This is Revelation chapter 15 and 16. There's not actually a lot of dying mentioned. It's more about torment. Painful sore, bowl 1, painful sores on all the mark, on all, with on everyone that has the mark of the beast. Bowl 2, every living thing in the sea dies. Bowl 3, all of the fresh water becomes blood. Lots of analogies here, isn't it? You can see the symbolism as well as the actual, think about like the plagues of Moses and the turning of the water to blood and things like that. And Christ is the living water and is the blood, and now you have the actual water turning to blood. This is basically God saying, if you wouldn't want the living water, here, have some blood. Bowl 4, the sun scorches with intense heat. Bowl 5, they plunge into darkness with intense agony, for instance. And it's really telling, here's Revelation, here's almost a breath. Revelation 16:11. And after all these things have just happened, and they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. We are here, once we reach the halfway point, we are past the point of repentance. Much like, and in a good analogy, at some point, Pharaoh had hardened his heart, and there was no opportunity for repentance. The judgments were coming on Egypt. Now we have this, but on a large scale. Bowl 6, demonic spirits leading the assembly for the last battle. These demonic spirits now have free reign over the entire, whoa. We aren't done yet. How does this all end? Is one you all know, right? The Battle of Armageddon. So here we are at the end of this 7-year period. All this tragedy is all taking place, and we get to, they align for this final battle. We won't go through all the details of the battles and all that kind of stuff. There's plenty of detail, but we get lost in all the detail. The idea is that the Antichrist and all of his forces are allied, and everyone is bearing down, and there's people from all different directions meeting in the battle of the Valley of Megiddo in Israel, and we're ready for the last battle. The world has literally fallen apart. Well, almost literally, and it's just about to literally fall apart. And what happens? Well, now we get to that point, when we get to that actual second of coming. The only thing that stops the world from totally wiping itself out, people from wiping themselves out, is Christ returning. And Christ returns, we won't go through all the details, but Christ returns to the Mount of Olives. And when he returns, there's a giant split, a giant earthquake, consumes all the armies and things like that. And Jesus returns to save the remnant of believers, what few are left. Immediately after Matthew 24, 29 to 30, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light. We read this part of the verse before. We didn't quite end it though. And the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. We get bowl number 7, the final judgment. That's sort of simultaneous with the Battle of Armageddon here, the end of the Battle of Armageddon.
So if the sun is darkened and the moon is only giving half light, how is there intense heat?
Good question. We don't know. Is this heat being driven down from heaven? Is this volcanic action and the earth literally breaking apart? Is it heat from the sun and we're not getting light? Certainly that is possible. We have nowadays we have solar flares and things like that that can actually be outside the visible spectrum, so they're not visible, but they bring intense heat. We don't know. And fortunately, I'm not going to stay around to find out. Okay? Okay. So they're great. Revelation 16:17, and the seventh angel poured out his vial or bowl into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, "It is done." Wow. Great earthquake destroys everything. Great hailstone, sun and moon darken. Chapters 17 to 19 talk about the fall of Babylon, the fall of all of mankind here. Verses 11 to 19 of chapter 19 describe the actual return of Jesus. And so let's tape fall of Babylon on here. As a result of that final judgment. And it ends, chapter 19 ends with verse 20, casting the Antichrist and the false prophet into the lake of fire. Okay. Oh, I don't have one that says lake of fire. I thought I did. Oh well. So they're cast into the lake of fire. They've got another lake of fire card coming up. Okay. And that brings us to Christ has come down. We've had the second coming. And everything is different now. Mankind has literally destroyed itself, except for this remnant that makes it through at the very end, because Christ has come to protect them. And we set up the millennial kingdom. One of the things that happens in the millennial kingdom, Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3. The devil and the demons are bound. So right at the beginning of the millennium. The devil and the demons are bound. That means we ought to have no more sin, right? Well, not so fast. But it is significant that the devil and the demon is bound. What else happens? The millennial kingdom is established. All sorts of Old Testament and New Testament prophecies that talk about Christ's kingdom is now established. Who's the ruler in Christ's kingdom? Another softball question. Christ is. Where's Christ ruling from? His throne. Here on earth. Now, the earth is all messed up, but it's certainly been changed significantly. But Christ established his kingdom here on earth. And as part of that, Israel is restored. All those promises made to Israel that have not been fulfilled, and that the Antichrist said he would fulfill and didn't, those are now all fulfilled. Israel is restored. All those promises fulfilled. Who's it populating? Well, those people that were saved and survived the tribulation. People were saved during the tribulation. Most of them were martyred. But at the end, there was a core that was saved. Not us. We were raptured out before. But people that were saved make it through, and they populate the millennium. And we won't go through all the details. How about us? Well, now we return. Now we're past, we covered them all up here. The marriage of the Lamb and all that kind of stuff. We are now reigning with Christ. Now, reigning with Christ is a bit generous for our role in it. What help does Christ have? But we do seem to have some role in terms of ministering to people and administering the kingdom and things like that. Another thing happens. The millennial temple is built. And there's even a description of it in Ezekiel. So now we get another temple. This is either the third or the fourth, depending on how you're counting. And they actually do sacrifices at it. Now, those sacrifices are not the sacrifices that they had before, and it describes them different. And there's theological reasons why they're doing sacrifices. It'd take us too long to go through all that. But that's worth noting. And what are we doing? We're reigning here with Christ. Okay? How long does that last? 1,000 years. That's why we call it the millennium. Again, we are so good at naming these things. Okay? Millennium means 1,000 years, right? It means 1,000. So 1,000-year period. So this goes on for 1,000 years. That little group of people that made it through into the millennium have now 1,000 years. By the way, 1,000 years of peace and prosperity and good health and all those wonderful things that are described. And we don't know how many there are by the end, but you can imagine that over 1,000 years, there's probably a lot of people. They've repopulated the earth. And so now we slip off into eternity all fat, dumb, and happy, right? Not so fast. We don't get a lot of details about what happens here, but we do get a few verses. Okay? There's also a few other things going on here that, we'll close this out. We have what I call the final revolt. The final revolt. This is in Revelation 20, chapter 7. Now, we've only a couple of verses from the beginning of the millennium in the first part of chapter 20. So we don't have a lot of details about the millennium. And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle. You can see why some people put that first fight over on this end of it. The number of whom is the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth and encompassed the camp of the saints about and the beloved city. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. Whew! And that's really all that we've learned about this thing. But we get the picture here. After 1,000 years, Satan is loosed. He rounds up all the humans that are willing to do it, and they have a final revolt. And how's that end for Satan? Not so good. Now, you can ask all sorts of questions about why did God choose this method, but if you think about it, it sort of makes sense. Can we blame anything that went wrong on the millennium, on Satan? No. Satan's bound, and his devils are bound. And we have Christ ruling there. And everything's peaceful, and yet we still have people at the end of that say, I'd rather have things my way. Satan says, okay, I can arrange that. And that final revolt is put down by God. And we get to the next thing, what we call the second resurrection. Remember we talked about the first resurrection was the resurrection of believers. Now here, all the way out at the end of the millennium, we have the second resurrection, and that's followed by, and that part of that is the white throne judgment, or the great white throne judgment. It comes from verse 11, so the next verse after what we just read. And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. How were they judged? According to their works. Okay? This is not a judgment on whether they're going to be saved or not saved. This is a judgment upon unsaved. And the only thing we can conclude is, and there's some verses that sort of back this up, their degree of punishment. But it's all going to be bad. Okay? I'm not suggesting that Dante had it all right when he had his seven levels of hell, or 11 levels, or whatever he had. But you get the idea. This is bad for everyone. It's going to be even worse for some people.
So these are people who live through the millennium?
No, so this is everyone who is unsaved throughout all of time. Oh, we hadn't heard of those guys, but they've been put in the parking lot for a while, haven't they? Okay.
So where are they?
Good question. We don't really know. It has been suggested that there's sort of like a, well, not purgatory. So, because the idea of purgatory is you can earn your way out of it. But it is the idea they're like in a hell, but a temporary hell. And they're held in that temporary hell, sort of like the difference between the county jail and prison, okay? You stay in the county jail for a while, you're still in jail, and then once you're sentenced formally, then you go to prison. And so that's probably the best way to think of this, is that they're in hell, but they're about to be put into a different hell. Because now, even the lake of fire, or even, it says, yeah, hell is going to be cast into the lake of fire. Death and hell are cast into the lake of fire.
So this sounds as if some of them, depending on their works, could be saved.
No,
At that point.
no.
Oh.
No, they're not saved. They're not able to be saved.
Okay.
They're in hell. It's just the final pronouncement has not been made.
To determine the level of punishment.
Right. Not unlike us, when once we die, we go to heaven, but it's not until the future that we actually get our resurrected bodies and we get our rewards that we're cast on. So it's the same idea. They've been in hell. Now that hell itself is going to be cast into the lake of fire. They're going from jail, and they were guilty. I mean, now the final sentence is done, and they're going to go to the eternal place. So don't get too wrapped up into this. It's like the hell that they're in now is temporary. It'll be replaced by the permanent hell, the lake of fire, at this time. Okay? No opportunity to escape. That can only be done by a decision while you're still living. Important message there, right? We're almost there. So it appears that there's, and I have a note that says, emphasize, this is not a separation of saved from unsaved. This is a judgment upon the unsaved. Okay? But it's just now those unsaved are formally sentenced and placed in their eternal place, the lake of fire, which was created for Satan, but, you know, it is what it is. And, huh? He gets to have some company. He doesn't get to rule it. All those cartoons we see of, you know, Satan cracking the whip and making the poor peons stoke the fire and things like that. No. Satan is suffering more than anyone, as, you know, but those that chose him share the same fate. And verse 14, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. So this is not a determination of whether your name was in the book of life or not. That's based on whether you made the decision. It's that your name was not written in the book of life, and everyone appearing here is not, this happens. Lake of fire is marked by eternal darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's Matthew 13:42. Everlasting destruction, 2 Thessalonians 1:8-9. Matthew 7:13 calls it destruction. Unquenchable fire in Mark. Matthew 18:8 says eternal fire. And we're not quite done, which is good because we got 5 minutes left. Because that leaves us there. Also gets us to the end of chapter 20. We flip the page, and luckily, going into 21, we get to throw all of this part away. Because in chapter 21, it talks about the new creation. Oh, there's where I'm going to tape Lake of Fire onto our chart there. Now we get to the new heaven and the new earth. So, Revelation 21:1, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. Why is the new heaven and the new earth? Why does the earth have to pass away? Well, first of all, it's a wreck by now. Okay, it's like the thing you see on the hoarder shows, and all demolished and things like that. The home improvement shows where all the walls are bashed in and all that kind of stuff. After all this, the earthquakes and the fire and the scorching, who would want to live there anyway? But even more fundamentally, it's marred by sin. Man's sin marred all of creation. And so all of creation has to be redone. This is the final act of being redone. The old heaven and earth are done away with, and a new heaven and new earth are created, one in which there is no sin. There is no sin curse. There's nothing like that. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. We talked a little about that when we were talking about the bride a couple of weeks ago. We get the New Jerusalem. Comes down. And it goes on and describes the New Jerusalem. I won't go through all the description, but you can go look it up.
The dimensions are interesting.
Yeah, I gotta get to the dimensions. That's a good point, and we ought to bring that out. Verse 3 says, and I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. God, really for the first time, is living with men. Now, we saw that in the temples. That's why I keep emphasizing the temples. And even in the reign of Christ during the millennium, Christ is living with us. But here's the first time that the actual words, the tabernacle of God is with men. And he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And God himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all their tears. And it says all sorts of really, really cool stuff that we ought to take a lot of stuff about it. Isaiah prophesied about it, for behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered, nor come to mind. In Isaiah, that was Isaiah 55:17. Isaiah 66:22 says something. 2 Peter 3:10 talks about the passing of the old earth and everything. This really is a callback to the creation, if you will. This is the recreation. As a matter of fact, Matthew 19:28 talks about it and uses the word regeneration, to be made anew. Isaiah uses similar words. And we get to the New Jerusalem. As Angela pointed out, we need to talk about the dimensions. It calls them, first of all, it mentions that heaven and earth are merged together. Okay, we think of heaven as the dwelling place of God and the earth as the dwelling place of man. And guess what? They be the same place now. It's 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles, which when you actually measure it is pretty mind-boggling. The footprint is most of the continental United States, from Canada to Mexico, from the eastern seaboard to the Rocky Mountains or so. That's the footprint of it. And in addition, it goes up that high. As a matter of fact, if it were composed of 13-foot stories, it would have 660,000 stories. Okay? Lots of room there. People have debated whether it's a cube or a pyramid. It talks about the river flowing out of it. That makes us think it might be a pyramid, and the language is, we can't be sure which. Has the river of life flowing out of it, and the tree of life is mentioned as being there. What's significant about the tree of life? When was the last time you heard about the tree of life? In Genesis, before the fall of man. And that was the thing that was lost at the fall of man. And now it's at the center. No more curse, no more sin, no more pain and suffering. You can have theological discussions about, does time cease to exist? So there's a couple of views. One is that really time ceases to exist and we just exist in this state. Another is that time continues to go on and it just goes on forever, infinity, and we exist in state. Who knows? We know what we know about it. Yeah, huh?
At that point, it won't matter.
Yeah, at that point it won't matter. All we know is this is our future. Whoa! Okay, all happy? Questions? We can dive out into any of the details, but okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
So during the millennium,
Yep.
when we reign with
Yep,
Christ, will we be, he'll be on earth?
yep.
Will we be?
We will be too. Most likely, when he returns, it talks about his armies coming along behind him, and that is most likely a reference to us. So we will ride behind him. Not much to do, but I'm happy. Happy to be on that team. Yeah. Christ does all the fighting and takes care of it, but he'll have some role for us in the return, and then we will be serving in some sort of role in our physical bodies, our resurrected physical bodies. So it won't be exactly the way we are now, but we'll have some role and we'll do something. And I don't know, I've only semi-jokingly said, well, maybe my job will be to go explore outer space, because that'd be really cool. Stuff like that. We don't know. Okay, everybody good? We're out of time. So, okay, we went through a lot today, but since this is the last class, I wanted to get to the end because we get to the happy stuff. Okay, thanks.